Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan. A new program is rolling out in St. Louis and is taking a new approach to 911 calls involving mental health issues by dispatching behavioral health professionals who are specially trained to respond to people in crisis. Now, we have talked about a lot of promising emergency first responder programs on this show, and usually when we talk about them, we're saying, oh, look at all the great results. But this program is a little bit different. And that's because responders with St. Louis's behavioral health program, originally called Cops and Clinicians, are working in conjunction with police officers. And this is a feature that critics say will lead to worse outcomes. And you can probably imagine why. In most cities, calls for mental health and other behavioral crises have traditionally gone to cops. And this hasn't resulted in positive outcomes. Police officers often make these sorts of situations worse. They're quick to escalate. They're quick to resort to violence. And studies show that around 1/4 of all people who are killed by police are experiencing problems related to mental illness, and people with untreated mental illness have also been found to be 16 times more likely to be killed during a police encounter than other civilians. And so even in best case scenarios, a law enforcement response is more likely to lead to arrest and incarceration, which only further destabilizes people who are vulnerable. And so in some ways, St. Louis's behavioral response program follows that basic argument. By dispatching specially trained mental health responders, the city hopes to take these calls off the plates of police and EMS workers, saving them time and effort while helping to ensure better outcomes for people in crisis. But St. Louis' approach, it differs from many of the programs we've discussed. Some jurisdictions have developed these programs as alternatives to police. But this program, again, is partnering directly with the police department. And supporters of first responder programs have often argued that sending mental health professionals instead of cops is what we should be doing, because people in crisis can get compassionate care without the threat of an arrest or violence or trauma that is often associated with police interactions. So for more on St. Louis's behavioral health response program and concerns about these sorts of co-responder models, I'm joined now by Kayla Reed, co-founder and executive director of Action St. Louis, and Brooklyn College professor Alex Vitale, who's also the author of The End of Policing. Thank you both so much for being here.
You bet.
Having me.
So Kayla, I'd love to start with you. Maybe you can start by giving us an update on the behavioral health response program. I understand that it's been operating as a pilot for a while. So how has that been going, and where does the city stand with its plans for an expanded rollout?
Well, today is a huge day in St. Louis. It's election day. And so we are many voters in St. Louis. I'll use this moment as a plug to say, if you have not yet voted, please be in line by 7 o'clock so that you can cast your vote. And what is at the top of the ballot today is the mayoral election. And so what we know is that under this current administration, Lyda Krewson, this program has been piloted. We've not seen the data on the pilot. We don't know the scale of the pilot. But what we do know is that this is adding this is the same kind of program with different wrapping paper, because anytime you send police, no matter who you send police, you are sending police. Who you send police with, police are still on the scene and ultimately are the decision makers on when a moment shifts away from the care that a clinician could provide to a carceral response. And so if it's taking too long, if the person who is experiencing trauma is not responding in the way that the officer sees fit, ultimately the officer has the most authority in those situations, which contributes to what we know, what you have said already, Alana, around increasing the risk of harm to a person who is suffering in that moment. And so we've heard the different candidates speak on this program. And what we as organizers are doing is agitating, because this program can live on its own without being partnered with the police. clinicians can, and in many localities across this country are, responding to the needs of community without having to have an officer on the scene. And in those moments, the data is coming back that the program is working. And so instead of pairing these very opposing ideologies on how to respond to traumatized communities, we think that separating them and giving the clinician program the funding it needs to be expansive enough to respond to our communities is the best way forward.
And since we see that responding without the police is a strategy that works, why is it that elected officials came up with this model? Where did that come from? And what did the debate around that look like?
I'm not sure where it came from, but I will say that this current administration has pandered to the folks who critique loudly that we need to divest from carceral solutions. There are people in this city and in this community who equate police with safety, and there are those who actually experience policing and know that that equation is not true. And so, what Mayor Krewson and her team have decided to do is to add more resources and expand the reach even more of an oversized police department, instead of investing into a clinicians program and embedding that into the health department.
So I want to hone in on one thing you said, which was basically saying that there's this perception that police equals public safety when we know that's not true. And Professor, this is something that you talk a lot about in your book. So I'd love to hear from you, why isn't that true? And what does the history of policing in this country tell us about why it isn't true?
Well, first, let me say something about what St. Louis is doing that's actually positive, which is that they've created within the 911 system a diversion program that involves diverting the calls to a telephone response that is completely separate from the police. This is modeled on a system in Harris County that's been extremely successful. And so we want to make sure to preserve those parts of what's being done that is about creating alternatives to policing, while we critique this idea that police are what exists to produce safety. And the problem we have in this arena is that for 40, 50 years, we've systematically defunded mental health services and then turned the consequences of that over to the police to manage. And really, it shouldn't be a surprise that the consequences of that have not been positive. That even when police don't use violence, even when they follow proper procedure, the outcomes still aren't very good. The police have very limited options in these situations. They can force someone to an emergency room, they can incarcerate someone, or they can try to informally resolve the problem on the spot. But none of that connects someone to long-term meaningful access to high-quality mental health services that are going to stabilize them and prevent future crisis calls that end up, relying on a police response.
And so what do you say to people who, and there are people like this in St. Louis, who say that it's necessary to have an armed officer alongside mental health responders in order to keep those mental health responders safe in case the situation escalates? Is there any truth to that?
Well, so far the data just doesn't really bear that out. We have two good sets of data now. One from Oregon, where a collection of cities have been using non-police crisis teams for many years now. And the latest full year data we have shows that these teams have been able to divert thousands of calls. In the case of Oregon, over 20% of 911 calls are now diverted to these non-police teams, and they have requested police assistance, not the use of violence or even the making of arrest, just police assistance in less than 1% of those calls. And in Denver, the new STAR program, they just released the first 6 months of data from their program. And in their program, they didn't request police assistance one single time. No violence was used, no arrests were made, and the situation was handled in a much better way at less cost to taxpayers. And I'll just say that, in St. Louis, they're making a lot of noise about how they've created these new positions, but so far it's about 16 positions. And when you compare that to a police force with about 1,200 armed officers, this is really a drop in the bucket of what we could do if we could free up some of those resources from policing.
Mm-hmm.
And Kayla, I see you nodding your head. Is there anything you want to add? And if not, I have a question for you.
No, that was, I think that Alex hit it right on the head, that this program, has been brought to St. Louis as being anchored by someone who was a police officer for 20 years. The program itself is being promoted as a partnership. When we know that clinicians have the training and the experience to handle these things and do handle them all on their own, every day professionally. And in these particular examples, Denver, Portland, as Alex mentioned, this is more reason to attempt the program separate from the police department. And and I think when I want to bring forth is this idea that in the immediate moment, what we have seen, I think back to Kajimi Powell in 2014. He was killed just 10 days after Mike Brown was killed, right down the street. And it was recorded on video. And the police chief, after he was killed, said he ran at officers with a knife. And when the video came out, you could clearly see he was suffering he was having a mental health crisis. And the officers, within 10 seconds of arriving, shot him to death. And there were no charges in the case. But beyond charges in the case, the idea that in that moment, someone with the proper training to identify the need, to identify the problem and address the need, that can happen without police being present. And we're talking about preserving life and moving people away from ending up in a jail cell in downtown St. Louis, where we've had yet another uprising inside of the City Justice Center. How many of those situations where folks have now been in jail for over a year could have been de-escalated and redirected into services that folks actually need to be thriving members of our community?
So talk to us about some of the issues you've seen on the ground with the co-responder model in comparison to this vision that you lay out where we're preserving life, as you say. Have you seen incidents of police making it more difficult, or any incidents of police helping?
Yeah, I've not seen the program in my day-to-day organizing work. And so, like Alex said, this was something that was the expansion wasn't even going to be 20 clinicians. The expanded version was 16 to 18 folks, and they were hiring when this program came out. And so I don't have real data. I'm sure they're going to say it takes months to get the kind of data that you want to present to the public. But what we are saying is that there is data in other places that says this program can and will thrive detached from the police department. And we have to question and interrogate why this program is requiring a partnership between experts and police to go into community. And I don't think, Action St. Louis doesn't think that this is the right pathway forward. When in actuality, what we should be doing is creating a program that has a robust number of clinicians, hundreds of clinicians, dozens of clinicians, so that we can actually start to address some of the issues that we're seeing in our communities. But 18 folks, that's not really enough, in my opinion, to actually present this as a viable or it's not an investment to see if this is worth a long-term investment. It's not at the scale that it needs to be to see if it should be a long-term investment for our community.
And something I've been thinking about is the fact that you've both sort of touched on this divestment that has existed for so long in mental health services. And it makes me think about sort of the cost of this program. Do either of you know if it's more costly to operate because there are dedicated officers? Is it more expensive to have these officers than it is to have clinicians who are trained and much better at responding to these sorts of incidents?
I haven't seen the budget for this program, but typically the pay of a mid-career police officer is dramatically higher than what it would be for this kind of clinical outreach worker. So yes, these programs are expensive, and if they continue to drive people into the criminal justice system, then there's the huge added expense of that. And that's why, as you mentioned, a lot of cities are looking not just at creating non-police crisis teams, but also trying to create some actual community-based mental health services so that people don't reach that crisis point in the first place. And if we're going to fund those kinds of interventions, we're going to need to generate new resources. And I think, if police are spending 10, 15, 20% of their time going on these calls, and we can take those calls away from them, then we should be looking to reduce those police budgets by a similar amount.
So is part of that argument too that police could potentially be removed entirely from the equation? And if so, what would that look like in terms of scaling up and in terms of what a response would look like? And I'll open this up to both of you, but I'll start with you, Kayla.
I'm sorry, restate the question.
So what would a program look like if police were taken completely out of the equation?
Yeah, so, I think about the fact that, as Alex has mentioned, we have a police force of 1,200 officers. And the city spends well over $150 million on policing in the city of St. Louis. And today, voters, again, are heading to the polls, hopefully supporting the earnings tax, which generates about half of our general operating budget. And about half of that goes to how we define public safety, which right now is policing, prosecution, and jails. And so that solution is not working. St. Louis remains a city that is suffering under continued violence. We are continuing to lose young people every day to violence. And there is an opportunity to make an intervention. When something is not working and you continue to invest in it, many people call that insanity, right? And so I think that this program has the opportunity to move a substantial amount of resources out of the police budget to hire enough clinicians to tackle, to move into these areas that are suffering under violence. Every year we spend close to $20 million in police overtime. There's always new hires happening inside of our police department budget. I don't think that there's a cost that's too high to try this and when we have data in other places that is showing that it's working, because every year we're investing in policing, and that is not creating the safety in our communities. And so this is about innovation. And so what we hope is that in moments right now where we need to be innovative because lives are on the line, that leadership will step up and say, I'm going to invest in this. And if there's not new money that's available for this program, I'm going to take money away from policing because that's not working and invest in this program so that we can run it at the scale that is needed.
In terms of how it would actually operate, what the good part about what St. Louis is proposing is that in the 911 dispatch, there would be an effort to train dispatchers to identify calls that could first be diverted to a telephone conversation with a clinician right then. And it turns out that in Harris County, they've been able to take 50% of all mental health crisis calls into 911 and divert them to this telephone-centered response, where someone can try to talk the person through a crisis, maybe get them to come in for a clinical assessment voluntarily, and reduce the risk of an escalation. Then what we could do is we could look at the models in Denver and Tucson and Portland, Oregon, where in a large percentage of the remaining mental health calls, we sent the 911 dispatcher, unless someone says there's someone with a gun or someone is running around with a knife, in those cases, it might still be necessary to send a police response, but this is a very, very small percentage of cases. And for the other cases, then a 24-hour trained team of non-police outreach workers and clinicians could be sent. And ideally, over time, you could actually build up some public health data that would allow you to know something about the situations you're responding to ahead of time. Interestingly, in the UK, where they have a national healthcare system and centralized computer records, when they send these kinds of outreach teams, they have access to the data about that person, what the diagnosis has been, what kind of medication they're on, who their doctor is, et cetera. And that's really the ideal way to go.
So it sounds like the idea is you want to build up sort of the public health infrastructure. You want to build up the ability to divert these calls into crisis response. And what's interesting to me is you could even just do it through a phone call, which is what you just said. 50% to a phone call, that's huge, and could save so much money for different cities around the country.
And more importantly, save lives, right? It could save lives, which is the goal, right? And I think that, often the kinds of programs that we are talking about get polarized in this political moment. That anytime you talk about moving resources away from policing, we have to take a side. We have to pick a side. And truly, if the goal of public safety is to help people, to create conditions where folks are getting what they need to survive and thrive in our communities, this is an easy choice. This is an easy investment. And as Alex has already mentioned, we've defunded these programs and forced an environment where the police are the catch-all for every single problem, and they're not equipped for every single problem to respond correctly. And when they are not equipped, what we often see is that they rely on violence and aggression to take control of a situation, because they don't have the training to respond to the needs of folks who are in these crises. And so this program truly is not just about saving dollars. It's about creating the conditions where people are getting what they need, and we're reducing the likelihood that use of force is implemented and lives are lost.
Well, that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you both so much for joining us today. Kayla, especially, enjoy
Yes,
the election.
listen, if you are watching this
Good luck
in St. Louis, please go vote. It's always a pleasure to be in the room with Alex. He is so brilliant. I learned so much from him. But if you are in St. Louis, please go vote. 7:00 is the last time. And these are the programs that are at stake. These are the type of situations where there are candidates who are open to these conversations, because ultimately the goal has to be preservation of life and assisting folks, right? And right now, it's not right now what we are doing is not working. So please go vote. If you heard nothing else I said today.
Thanks so much. Well, there you have it. Police do not equal public safety, and that's something that we've stressed multiple times on segments throughout the Appeal Live, which is that there are all these sorts of other models that can work. But it is necessary to have caution with these models, that we're not just creating new tools that mimic policing. And there is a risk that could be the case in St. Louis, particularly depending on the results of today, where when you have police officers accompanying mental health responders, there's this real risk of police officers being the ones in charge. And we've seen historically how problematic that can be. Police officers are not equipped to help somebody who's dealing with crisis. They are not equipped to, as Kayla said, creating the conditions of safety, the conditions where people can thrive. They're not equipped to be able to diffuse violence. They're not equipped to be able to give somebody the health and safety access that they really need. And so until we see programs throughout the country really being ramped up that actually invest in those infrastructures, mental health infrastructures, physical health infrastructures, it's not likely we're going to see real safety, particularly in St. Louis. So it will be interesting to see how this program develops, if it will shift, and if it will keep the good aspects of it that divert calls, to create conditions of safety and to create a model that preserves human life. So thank you so much for joining us today on the Appeal Live. You can continue to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest news. We will see you next time.